Cool. Hey everyone, thanks for joining. Um, my name is Samraj, and I'm a member of the outreach team for Hack Illinois. Today, we're extremely excited to have David Hardy joining us to talk about education equality and inequality and what we can do to combat it. David's absolutely amazing. He's currently the managing partner and VP of People and Culture for Education Elements. But prior to this, he's been credited with turning around some of the lowest performing school districts, and he has an absolutely astounding track record. But I'll hand it off to David to take it from here.
Awesome. Thank you for that introduction and thank you for this background, first and foremost. This is amazing. And it's good to see everyone out there and excited to be a part of this conversation. As Samraj said, at David Hardy, I'm managing partner of a great firm who supports districts across the country to think about how to change the way that we educate America's children through our leaders and through our teachers. So I'm lucky to be here because Samraj reached out, Mega reached out, and I was excited. I think this is a great venture, and I just am so humbled to be a part of the conversation. With that said, I'm going to share my screen so we can get started with the presentation and have a conversation around this theme of the land of the free and the home of the enraged, the home of the enraged. And you'll see in a few minutes what I mean by that. When we think about education and we think about those that lead in this space, it takes a lot of hope. It takes a lot of courage. It takes a lot of stamina to think about how we can become great. That's the reason why I got into education. When I was coming out of school, I joined Teach for America, flew to Watts that summer and taught that summer in one of the lowest performing schools in the state of California. And I was met by a young man named Carlos who was in a classroom in a space that, um, you know, wasn't one of the best spaces you could imagine or could see for kids learning. Yet he was in a room in the summer in Watts where hearing from the kids, they said they had to walk out one side of the room versus the other, depending on the color of their clothing, whether it was red or blue. And meeting Carlos as I came in, he handed me his essay and said, I trust you to read my essay and help me become a better student. I didn't know him, he didn't know me, but something that he said and saw in me, I guess, intrigued him to at least hand me his paper. And that's how I began my teaching career and continue to lead with hope because of young people like him. This is my position. That's my Twitter handle. I have this big goal of increasing my Twitter followers. So if you could drop a follow, that would be appreciated as we go through. So that's me in a nutshell. We're going to go on a walk today. We're going to go on a walk this evening and just talk about some of the challenges within education. But it's much broader than that. And you'll see that in a few minutes. And through this walk, I'm going to be extremely transparent. At the same time, my transparency will also probably show images that will be potentially controversial in the sense of have polarizing opinions that people will see when they see images. But most importantly, it is a narrative that I at least want to share to provide a perspective on what I have experienced, what I believe a lot of children in this country, especially in tough, unique urban environments experience, and things that we need to really face as a country if we're ever going to change the way that kids are educated, young people are educated in our country. So I want you to take a walk with me on this journey of educational inequality towards equality and all the things that get in the way. So please know that I will be putting a lot of different topics out there for consumption. With that said, I want to get a little interaction going. I don't know how this is going to be made possible. I know we're streaming live. I don't know how many folks are out there now, but I would love to see and hear the best movie or TV show of all time. If you have a best TV show or a best movie that's running through your head or something that you just watched again or something you're binging on Netflix or Hulu, I would love to know what it is. I know there's a chat out there. You can drop it in the chat. I will be able to see some of those comments as they come through. I would love to see and hear what you all say are some of those best movies and TV shows. If there are great things that are coming up, I will shout them out. If I think they're, I think there's some good shows out there. I would love to highlight them and share them with all of you. But there's a reason why I bring this up as a topic. Every year that we've had movie or TV, there's been a show. There's been a culmination of celebration around how people have felt about particular shows. One particular event that happens every year that I became a big fan of as I grew a little bit older was the Oscars. I don't know if there's anyone out there that has watched the Oscars or seen the Oscars or maybe even been to the Oscars. I envy you if you have, and have experienced just the prestige and the honor and the celebrity of the event. That's really interesting and impactful in so many ways. I bring the Oscars up because there was a movie, two movies a couple of years ago, in which they were in the running for Best Picture. I'm not sure if anyone has seen the movie La La Land or Moonlight, but in 2017 there was this clash of two very different movies, two very different images of the world, two very different casts competing for the top honor in film. And in this particular year, you had the Ryan Goslings of the world who, just kind of branched off and did something pretty amazing as he started to sing and dance in a different way. And in Moonlight, you had this description of Black America that not many have seen or experienced or have understood. And it was portrayed in a way that allowed different insight and nuance view of Black people that was pretty powerful and profound. In this particular situation in the Oscars in 2017, this cast was called to the stage as Best Picture. If you were watching these Oscars in 2017, they were crowned the best picture. This cast was selected. However, as I was sitting there watching and saying, "Wow, how did they win?" There's someone who runs to the mic and says, "We have an error. There's an error. Moonlight actually won Best Picture." Now, mind you, there was a lot of you could hear like the murmur and the shuffling of people and the surprise, and like they were curious if this guy was joking around. He actually had to go to the mic and say, "This is not a joke. Moonlight actually won." There was just the shock and experience of like, did this really happen on national television moment? When they actually shifted to Moonlight being deemed Best Picture. It's interesting, and the reason why I bring this up, it's interesting because as we think of the Oscars, we think of we think of just how they do business and who stereotypically has won most of the awards handed out by the Academy. And it wouldn't have been a surprise to most people if La La Land won. The surprise was Moonlight actually winning. And the fact that it happened that way showed me just the irony of how jarring and challenging it is to change something that is so conformative and status quo. So when we think about La La Land and we think about the images of La La Land, if you have a chance to see it, it's this magical film that just depicts, love and dream and the ability to just be great for all. When in the reality, the land of the free that we live in has a ton of controversy and difference. It has a ton of injustice that sits right on our doorsteps, in front of the White House and inside and outside a lot of the homes around our country, where things are just not right, where we continue to see unfortunate realities for so many people of color, specifically Black Americans, that are falling to the injustice of the second pandemic that lives in our country next to COVID-19, while we still portray this image of a perfect La La Land. The question is, why is that? So for a minute or two, Jeffrey Canada is going to talk about how that has become the way that it is in America, why we have this approach towards American living, and talk through the lens of education, and poses a question at the end that pushes our thinking around why we operate the way that we do. Jeffrey Canada was the founder of the Harlem Children's Zone, fantastic speaker, fantastic leader, and really pushed on what was possible for kids in Harlem, but more important, kids that look like him. So let's take a minute to listen to Jeffrey Canada. maybe listen to Jeff again.
This year, there are going to be millions of our children that we're going to needlessly lose. That we could right now, we could save them all. You saw the quality of the educators who were here. Do not tell me they could not reach those kids and save them. I know they could. It is absolutely possible. Why haven't we fixed this? Those of us in education have held on to a business plan that we don't care how many millions of young people fail. We're going to continue to do the same thing that didn't work. And nobody is getting crazy about it, right? Enough to say enough is enough. So here's a business plan that simply does not make any sense. You know, I grew up in the inner city, and there were kids who were failing in schools 56 years ago when I first went to school. And those schools are still lousy today. 56 years later. And you know something about a lousy school? It's not like a bottle of wine, right? Where you say like 87 was like a good year, right? That's not how this thing, I mean, every single year, it's still the same approach, right? One size fits all. If you get it, fine. And if you don't, tough luck. Just tough luck. Why haven't we allowed innovation to happen? Do not tell me we can't do better than this. Look, you go into a place that's failed kids for 50 years, and you say, so what's the plan? And they say, well, we're going to do what we did last year, this year. What kind of business model is that? Banks used to open and operate between 10 and 3. They operate 10 to 3. They were closed for lunch hour. Now, who can bank between 10 and 3? The unemployed. They don't need banks. They got no money in the banks. Who created that business model, right? And it went on for decades. You know why? Because they didn't care. It wasn't about the customers. It was about bankers. They created something that works for them. How could you go to the bank when you were at work? It didn't matter. Then they don't care whether or not Jeff is upset he can't go to the bank. Go find another bank. They all operate the same way, right? Now, one day, some crazy banker had an idea. Maybe we should keep the bank open when people come home from work. They might like that. What about a Saturday? What about introducing technology? Now, look, I'm a technology fan, but I have to admit to you all, I'm a little old. So it was a little slow, and I did not trust technology. And when they first came out with those new contraptions, these tellers that you put in a card and they give you money, I was like, there's no way that machine is going to count that money right. I am never using that, right? So technology has changed. Things have changed, yet not in education. Why?
The question is why? Why hasn't education changed? And we think about what Mr. Canada so brilliantly shared. There are some very intentional reasons why. We're going to talk about those. So if we think first about some other things that refuse to change, some of you may not even recognize this logo, but when I was growing up, Blockbuster was our favorite place to go on a Friday, pick up, believe it or not, before DVDs, there were these things that were larger and you put them into a VCR. And it's just hard for me to imagine now that everything is streaming through my television. But there was a time when I would go to pick up tapes to watch on the weekend. I would go to Blockbuster. However, Blockbuster had this opportunity to join on with this upstart company who came to them and said, we're going to actually move all of our video content to a digital platform. And believe it or not, Blockbuster said, you know what? No, I'm good. I think we're going to be fine. And we like our brick and mortar stores. We're going to continue this model of business. And as you all know, the reality of the situation is this company, one, and decided to innovate and continues to innovate and do tremendous things, not only from a video digital content, but also just from a social entrepreneurial concept, which I really truly respect, and disrupted the way that we see and indulge in film and TV. The results is that Blockbuster no longer exists. So the reality of the situation is that there was a disruption that was created to change the status quo. However, in education, that is yet to exist. And the question still remains why. When we think about disruption and innovation, it happens in a couple of different ways. There's some fundamental things that we consistently expect. When I went to Blockbuster, I knew to go on Friday to make sure that I got the movies that were just released and I could pick them up if I got there at the right time. I knew what to expect. However, when there's a disruption to a system, that disruption creates what's next. And sometimes it's hard for people to conceptualize what is next if they're so comfortable with the fundamentals of what they got every single time. Hence Blockbuster's mentality to stay where they were. However, if we look at the way that our world operates and the way that the people consume information, consume resources, and consume life, we actually are looking for what's next, even though there are times when we resist it. Companies that like Amazon, like Netflix, Whole Foods, Uber, all of these companies found an industry, found a business, looked at the fundamentals of that business, created disruption, and caused us to think more quickly about what is next. And many times people are reluctant to see what is next because they don't know what it looks like. But in these situations, what next is actually what won. However, in education, we still do not have that. Because the United States education system is perfectly and intentionally designed. So I'll say that again. The United States education system is perfectly and intentionally designed. That probably isn't a surprise to some. It may be a surprise to others to hear me say that after you see some things I'm about to show. But it is. It's a perfect system. But the system is perfect for some, far from all. And the reason why that is because school systems across this country, mostly those people that live in urban centers or in rural pockets of the country that don't have the resources and wealth that allow them to attend schools that are higher performing, are the ones that suffer. That's not who the system was designed for. The system was always designed for the affluent and the majority of America at the time, which was white. So if we look at this cycle here, education usually starts with where you live. And wherever you live tends to determine the quality of school that you attend. And that quality of school ultimately leads to your employment opportunities and the amount of money you will make, and then creating generational wealth for your family. And that cycle has been going on for years and years. The reality of this situation is that this zip code identification is the part where the inequality begins. So how did we get to a place where the zip codes were intentionally designed to create this inequality? Let's see. Because if we think about it, Black Americans in this country make 2/3 of that of whites. People of color are more likely to live in poverty. And the majority of the children in this country who were born, by the way, by 2024, the majority of children born into this country will attend school are children of color. 75% of them go to schools that are impoverished and are underperforming. So what does that mean for us? How did we get to this place where kids who are born into our country are put into zip codes that don't allow them to be successful? And some may say, well, that's just how things are. But the reality is this. There are some very intentional things that were put into place in our country that established laws that created the outcomes that we currently see today. They started first with housing. And in 1934, the Federal Housing Administration was established and created, and tucked under the bylaws of that policy in 1934 was a system that was creating folks that had nice housing and those that did not. And if you look at the history of our country racially, and you look at our history of our country economically, you knew who would benefit from that type of legislation. That legislation was backed up by the Employment Acts of 1935 and 38, and then supported further by the GI Bill in 1944, which provided funding to certain individuals in this country, white Americans in particular versus people of color, who were giving different advantages, so that if there was a question around who could qualify for housing, it would be the ones that were more able to provide more money and had better wages And if we look at those bills were designed to benefit some versus the other. And therefore, we're able to get into housing. A byproduct of that is then where people did live and reside, change the way that they actually were able to live successfully. And that's when you begin to see the creation of slums and, unfortunately, poorer neighborhoods that really were not the fault of the individuals, but by the fault of the constructs that put them in these spaces, that ultimately created a divide of the haves and the have-nots. So in 1969, when the Black Party Panther came out and provided free breakfast to kids, it was a recognition that there was a challenge with getting quality food to kids across this country. And because of that, we saw a divide in what kids were able to, how they were able to feel when they went to school, and therefore that impacted their performance at school, which then impacted their ability to achieve in the classroom, and so on and so forth. Another pathway that was intentionally designed to ensure that there was challenges. So what does this actually mean? So this is legislation from years ago, right? Things have changed since then, but let's look at some of the numbers. Again, people of color are more likely to live in poverty, and that hasn't changed from the 50s and 60s drastically all the way up through 2019. We're seeing that men, in particular white men, make more money than people of color and or women, where people of color only make 60% of that income that white men do. And unfortunately, the same trend is created for women as well. And then when we think about the income gap, is creating a wealth gap between the median household income of individuals in this country, where white Americans make up to 10 times more median household income than people of color. And then this piece that people don't think about as much is the fact that the quality of food also resides in where you live. And that food determines on how well you're able to perform and excel at school and work. And in this situation, African Americans, only 8% of African Americans have a grocery store in their census tract. And in low income zip codes, you're more likely to have a convenience store that'll sell a lot of junk foods and other things that are not high density, nutrient rich foods than those of white families. So put all of these pieces together, and what you will find is some realities that became to truth. Redlining, if you're unfamiliar with this topic, where there were literally neighborhoods that were not made available to people of color, particularly Black Americans, for fears of many of things, but more importantly, wanted to keep things separate and unequal, and therefore separating the haves and the have-nots. Continued over policing over the years has dominated the way that we look at children of color and how we think about who needs what to be successful. There's more likely to be a police officer or security guard in a low income school than a social worker or someone who can provide mental health support. And we think about the concentration of poverty, and we look at what happens in food deserts and food swamps, where the quality of foods in concentrated poverty areas does not help the brains and minds of young people. We put all this together and you get this. You get the land of the enraged. You get the home of the enraged, where we have clashes of those who believe they're doing what is right for America and people who just want a space in America. So with that said, this cycle continues. The reality is created by housing inequalities, the unemployment bias that is there, or employment bias that exists, and the inequalities of the well-being of people, of the food they eat and the care that they give are given. So when kids come to school, they're more likely to have home insecurities in high poverty areas for children of color. They're more likely to have lower household income, and they're also more likely to fall victim to health disparities. And I say all of these pieces because the reality of the situation is this. These school systems are directly controlled by school boards and superintendents who drive the genesis and direction of school districts. 78% of school districts are run by white Americans, mostly white males. So when you think about the dynamics that created this situation, those that put these things in place historically continue to control the power and direction, so that the person who ultimately is answering these questions of how to close the achievement gap, how to get parents involved, how to control behavior issues, are doing the same things over and over and over again, similar to what Mr. Canada was speaking to. We continue to do the same thing over and over again. But why? Part of the why is that when we think about this, we're like, well, everyone had a telephone at some point. Funny story, I showed this picture to my son. He said, what is that? had to tell him it was a telephone because all he ever sees now is a phone that he has in his hand. So with that said, in schools, we continue to say, well, if everyone just has a telephone, then everyone will be fine, right? So let's just get more telephones. When in reality, we need something drastically different. Except when we look at who is running our country and who is running America, it's still the same. It's still the same people. I Googled CEO. One of the first pictures that came up was this.
I don't understand, but I found something related. Do you want to know whether a CEO is an owner?
No, thank you, Google. Hence the technology that sits in my own office. So with that said, when we think about disruption and we think about innovation and we think about the fundamentals of education, they have not changed. They have not taken on the Amazon or the Netflix or the Uber approach in any stretch of the imagination. We continue to do the same thing. And here's this chance in the middle of a pandemic, one of a virus and one of social unrest, where we actually could do something different in education. Here is our chance. I had this chance before the pandemic when I was the superintendent most recently in Lorain, Ohio. Lorain, Ohio sits about 25 minutes outside of Cleveland, and it had about 6,500 kids, majority of children of color, in a very rough part of the state where income levels were low, housing quality was low. But the vibrance of the community was beautiful. The people were amazing. The kids were tremendous. And the buildings, as you can see, that kids were going to were fantastic. However, when we look at what was the underpinning of this, we found that this to be true for my kids. It was the second lowest performing school district in the state. Less than 25% of his kids were reading on grade level, and only 1% of the kids were graduating college and career ready. I'll say that again. Out of high school, when I first got there in 2017, 1% of the kids graduating high school were college and career ready by state standards. That is America. So the challenge that I was walking into was not only, again, the historical challenges that I've walked through, the historical challenges within education that we spoke about, but the reality that these were the numbers for children of color in a community that wanted something better for their kids. So my question to you would have been, one of the lowest performing districts in the state, what would you do with it? For the sake of time, I'm going to push on and see, for you all to see exactly what I attempted to do. And if I were to now go forward, what I would continue to do. So in this idea of disrupting a system where the fundamentals of what to expect, they were very used to kind of reporting to school at a certain time, meaning teachers and kids. They were very used to a very rote way of educating and grading kids. They were very used to the leadership that had been in the community for years. And for me to come in, I decided to completely disrupt that. I changed the way that we actually graded our kids. So we moved from a traditional A to F platform, and we actually provided grades for effort, and we provided grades for character, but we also provided grades based on mastery of content versus just A's and B's, depending on the quality of work that you showed up with. It was actually the master of your standards. And we tried to push on this idea of being someone who was thinking on the forefront of how to push kids differently and push teachers differently on how to educate them. The results were this. There were 6 components of the state report card, and there were a few that we had exponential growth just in 2 years. The number of kids that were prepared for college exponentially grew from 4% to 18.7%. While there are still people questioning, really, did they really make gains? Were the state just changing the bar? This is why the numbers look good. But the reality was true that we actually made huge gains. We closed the gap. Our gap closing score went from 6.4% in 2016-17 to 87.9%. And to prove all those wrong, that we were just, the bar just moved and we just happened to benefit from it, of the schools that were the lowest performing in the state, we actually had the 3rd largest growth and the 3rd largest overall grade change in the entire state of Ohio when it comes to the lowest performing schools in the state at the time. So with that said, we were one of the fastest growing, fastest improving states. Fastest improving school districts in the state. But this wasn't met with a ton of resistance. This was one of our town halls. This is actually a bunch of folks who were coming to see and hear about our performance, but none of which depended on the way that I was the way that I was presenting, or didn't really depend on the way that I was thinking about this, but just didn't like my idea of changing the way of educating kids and disrupting the way that we teach and learn, and therefore was met with a ton of resistance. And for this reason, and in this picture, it's hard to see it because it's just a static picture, but this is one of the most tense moments of my career. In this meeting, I was actually approached by a parent demanding my resignation. As she was demanding my resignation, she was inches from my face, and I could feel the spit from her face, from her mouth, hit me in the face, as she screamed at me and berated me at the end of the town hall, to the point where I was walked out by security because of the folks were afraid for my safety. And this was just a community that was very angry that I was disrupting the way that we were educating kids, even though statistically it was very clear the right thing to do. So I say all this to say, we have to continue to reimagine anyway. And the moment to do so is now more than ever. So in this disruption, changing the way that we think now is changing the way that we think about disrupting the digital environment for kids. So what is it that we need to provide to ensure that kids are successful? I can't profess that I have all the answers, but I have a hunch that there are people out there that are thinking about taking the leap to think about education differently and thinking about how to create the Amazon effect for kids across this country. And there's three things that you should and need to think about. One is resist the negativity of changing the way that education happens for kids. For many, many kids across this country, and I'll say specifically to the kids that I have had the privilege of attempting to provide a better space and a better experience for, it's met with a lot of anger and rage and negativity, but it doesn't have to always be that way. And it doesn't have to stay that way if you change the way that we educate our kids. And I think the powerful piece of this is realizing that you're going to be met with this level of resistance and potential negativity, and you still fight through it. So finding a way to resist the negativity. Second is resisting being the same. I think Mr. Canada articulated this in the beginning. You saw the story of how school boards and superintendents for years have created environments for many kids, not all, but many kids in some of our lowest performing districts. And there's a need for us to disrupt the way that we think about that relationship and how we push on those outcomes. And I'm so lucky to work with so many districts right now who are thinking so differently in a powerful way because they have tremendous boards and tremendous school leaders. So the idea of being the same isn't going to change our outcomes. The idea of resisting the need to be the same will. So as you think about changing the way that we educate kids and what we can do, think about what that technology should and could look like for our kids that may not have access to internet. What does that technology potentially look like for that child that may have a desire to learn visually through conversation and video versus the written word? How does this play out in thinking about what our kids need when they go back to in-person education, and how that experience now has shifted, and what can we do in those spaces to disrupt the way learning goes? I raise these questions because those are the ones we should be thinking about as we think about disrupting the way education takes place, as we move into a greater digital platform, as we rethink and reimagine the way that we can educate America's children. So resist the idea of being the same, because this is the reality for us right now. I know this is the reality for me most days of the week, where I have Zoom and I have a laptop up and I'm taking notes. We are now sitting in spaces virtually with people globally every single day. There was a point in time just last year when schools would say, I don't know how we move to a digital platform, or I don't know how we can provide education. I actually don't know how we can work from home, were some organizational questions and retorts to people saying that we need to move to a virtual environment. But here comes a pandemic that has changed the way that we live every single day. And it forced us into the space of operating and being different. It forced us to think about the way that we live and learn completely differently. It forced us to not be the same. And because of that, we learned a lot about ourselves. We learned that we actually could survive in a Zoom environment. We actually could thrive in this space. We can invent, we can think outside the box. We still can connect in so many ways. So why is education any different? And as we think about this digital platform and thinking about providing a digital experience that makes kids feel great, this is our opportunity to get it right. So lastly, resist and disrupt. Resist and disrupt. And what I mean by this is as you think about education 2040, 2050, 2060, think about this moment where we're sitting in front of Zooms, where we're sitting on YouTube, when we're looking for the answers. And we're seeing kids, walking around with, iPads in their hands or iPhones in their pockets. They're already walking around with the technology where they could be successful. Now it's our job to give them the software that will allow them to become brilliant, allow them to reach their full potential, allow them to disrupt the way that we think, the way we need to live, and present a way that we can live. And that starts with people who are willing to disrupt and resist being the same and resist the negativity that lives around us in our houses, in our neighborhoods, in our states, in our country, and around the globe. So I ask you all, as you think about these three things that you can do to change outcomes for kids, as I attempted to do as a superintendent and have done in other cities across this country, here's our opportunity to truly resist and disrupt. So I ask you all to be the change. Think about what you can now do to change the way that we educate kids through the digital environment that we just haven't seen before. Here's your chance to resist and disrupt. Thank you.
Wow, that was great. You brought up a lot of good points, and I'm sure there's a lot that all of us can take away from your presentation. So we have a few questions lined up, so let's go ahead and get to those.
Awesome.
Let's see, the first one I see is, why do you think the system for the majority of Americans has stayed the same, even though the majority is now so much more different than what it was before?
Yeah, there was actually a slide I took out that kind of spoke to this, because this is a fantastic question. The majority of our country, yes, has changed. It is a lot more diverse. It's a lot different than it was in the 50s and 60s. But what hasn't changed is the power dynamic and who actually controls the purse strings, the political power, and ultimately the well-being of people. So when we look at our police force, the majority of our police force is still white Americans. The majority of our government is still very much the same, as it is becoming more diverse. But in this country, and when we think about who is running our states, we right now do not have a governor, a Black governor, and very few governors that would even articulate that they are of color across this country, and they run our states. We look at our healthcare system. The majority of our doctors do not look like they're patients. And so as long as those three big buckets still have the controlling interests of this country, the mindsets of who needs service and who should be benefiting from those services will still remain the same. Are we moving closer? Absolutely. Are we starting to awaken to the reality that because there's different perspectives and diversity that surround the things that need to happen for people, that it's not all bad, that's not, you won't lose out if you give a little. I think we're starting to see that. But at the same time, because of the controlling interest being still with the majority, creates that dynamic.
Yeah. Okay. The next question I see kind of related to that is, where do you think the opportunity is for large corporations to change these trends?
Yeah, I think there's a few places. And I think some corporations are really thinking hard about this and doing a lot of smart things. First, you got to name it. And with the unfortunate death of George Floyd, I think a lot of companies were forced to name that they stood for and believe in anti-racist policies. They stood for and believed in Black Lives Matter. They stood and believed that they did not want to continue to be a part of the problem. Now, that was the first thing. Now, mind you, I will say, I still see those statements and still want to see action behind that, because action speaks louder than words. So that was the first step. The second thing corporations can do is change the way that they continue to grow. When they think about professional learning, when they think about hiring and staffing, when they think about who sits on their boards, they need to change and diversify who that leadership is. And then the third thing I think is probably the most prevalent thing that they can do is making sure that they're giving, especially corporations that are billion-dollar companies, think differently about where they're giving money, where they're investing into their communities, how they're investing in their communities, and how they're investing in the most important resource that they have, and that's their human capital, to make sure that it represents the people that they serve.
Cool. The next question I have is more related to technology, and it's, what type of software do you think will aid in this disruption to assist education of all children?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question, and literally could be the $1 million question, right? I think there is a need for some tremendous thinkers that will create a platform or a way or an experience that will help kids stay connected, but also allow them to travel, if that makes sense. So I envision a software platform that allows kids to think differently about teaching and learning, while also taking them to those experiences so that they glean something different about the world, about education, about an experience or a difference across cultures, that will allow them to think about how to problem solve, how to collaborate, all the things that all companies are actually asking for. They're not actually asking for ACT results. They're not asking for your SAT results. They're not asking for your transcripts. They're asking for you to be able to think. So if there is a solution, a software that's out there that helps kids think differently and puts them in positions across the world that allows them to experience difference and problem solve through it, I think that is the software we need. I don't know what that is and what that looks like, but hopefully we find it soon.
Okay. The next question we have is, it says, I like the idea that you can change the standards of grading to move towards effort rather than tests. How can you scale this idea effectively?
Yeah. I think there's a few things, and I'll be honest, I don't think I went about it the best way. I said K to 12. I said K to 8 for my school system. I wanted that change immediately. I think the best way to scale it is probably to start at a younger age, because younger kids are learning a lot of their motor skills and things of that nature. So it won't be foreign for kids, but also for educators and for families to grapple with that. And as kids go up through the school system, add it to your policy or district's policy as you go from pre-K to K, first, second, and third, until you move throughout the entire school system. I also think there could be some policy recommendations made to legislation for them to think about how that could be done well, to scale it not only to that district, but across an entire state. But I do think it is the right move. I think when we've over-tested, we have under-resourced, and we've demanded kids to do well on one test in April and May and not actually enjoy the experience for the other 8 months of the year and of the school year. And so therefore, they're not getting the richness of what learning should be about, because they're focused, or they're being told to focus on a test. So nonetheless, scaling is probably grade level by time, over time, but more importantly, starting with the mindsets potentially of those policymakers in the state.
Perfect. And I think this will be the last question we'll be taking. So it reads, do you think that the pandemic will cause permanent disruption to the field of education?
I surely hope so. And I say that from a place of being in some of the most challenging districts in the country over the past 17 years of my life. And I am fearful that kids will continue to go back to those environments. And those environments, for the majority of our kids, at least that I had the pleasure and opportunity to serve, were not the conditions that were going to yield change and yield levels of equity, but then also equality that will allow them to thrive. So I'm hoping, if nothing else, that this time that we have right now, and this window starting to shrink as we get closer to a vaccine, and as we start to think, that we could get back into school buildings, we need to quickly think about how we now can disrupt and resist the desire to do the same thing as we've done before. So yes, it can, but it's going to take minds like all of you out there to push on that status quo and demand something different so that people operate differently in education spaces.
All right, amazing. Well, that brings us to our time. So thank you everyone for joining us. And thank you, David, for taking out some time to come here and speak to us about this. I think everyone learned a good deal, or at least I hope everyone learned something. We sent out a form in the YouTube chat for our attendees to go ahead and fill out, and you can enter the raffle through that form. The password is Reimagine 2020. But yeah, thank you everyone for coming out, and that'll end it for us.
Awesome. Thank you so very much. I really appreciated being here.
Thank you.
Take care.